While economic and health experts in Israel weigh in daily on how to save the Israelis medically and financially, there is little talk regarding a consequence of the virus that could cause the most damage: mental health. Over 1.2 million Israeli adults reported deterioration in mental and emotional state, but that figure was for the first lockdown. Now, researchers report a 40% increase in that number for a total of 1,680,000.
The first is social distancing and the quarantine. Many people are alone now, and alone for long periods of time and isolated. Depression and anxiety, we've been seeing a lot of these people getting worse, and also people without pre-existing issues. It's just a problem.
The issue of mental disorders in Israel is not new. Unfortunately, it was never properly addressed by authorities, as no funds were allocated to it. And now, with the current political chaos and budget deadlock, it seems highly unlikely that the regime would pay attention to this problem.
People are out of jobs, people don't have enough money.
Even in the military, Israelis who are drafted there fake mental health disorders just to go AWOL from the military. We are talking about 1/3 of the Israeli males and 44% of females avoid being drafted into the military for mental health reasons. Mati Kaspi, one of Israel's leading musicians, posted a message on his Facebook page announcing that he and his family were leaving Israel in order to protect their mental health. He blames the Israeli regime for what he called the sad situation the regime creates for its citizens and culture. Mental health experts are warning of another epidemic in Israel. They say that the emotional and psychological impact of the coronavirus pandemic are no less severe than the havoc wreaked on Israel's health system and the economy. Psychologist Elad Mardo of Haifa University, who is behind the study, reports a 300% increase in requests for psychological treatment. The data shows that 25% of Israelis over the age of 21, that is approximately 1.2 million people, report a deterioration in their mental and emotional state after the first lockdown. This while 26% say the emotional state of their children has taken a turn for the worse. According to the professor behind the study, these are catastrophic numbers. The issue of mental health in Israel is not new. It has always been a social issue that the regime never really found a cure for. Israelis do not seek help because there are few problems. Many people do not seek out mental health services. Mental health services cost money, and as people feel the extended economic strain, mental health support is often viewed as non-essential. About 87% of Israelis with mental health issues stated that they simply could not afford to seek help for their mental health, according to a report published by the American Psychological Association. Due to almost non-existent programs amidst the political chaos and budget deadlock, there is no support for the unemployed to relieve the most severe economic distress. Steps to address the mental health issues in Israel are not being taken so correctly. Researchers point out to the lack of educational campaigns among Israelis regarding identification of mental health problems and appropriate use of mental health services offered by the health plans. Israelis are unaware of what is available.
First of all, a lot of doctors that could provide some kind of assistance or first diagnosis, family doctors, general physicians were not available at that time, and for a while you couldn't reach the mental health clinics, and there was a big confusion at the beginning why you couldn't reach psychologists and mental health workers. That was one source. People were locked down at home, and that caused both social isolation and a lot of anxiety among people. People didn't know what was going on. In addition, bear in mind that people were detached from and disconnected from their communities, from their schools, from their everyday life. And all that caused a lot of stress and a lot of times depression as well. So that could explain some rise in mental health states. At the beginning, we saw the Prime Minister showing up in himself, in person, showing up in prime time and addressing the nation. But the way he addressed it, I believe, caused more panic. He wanted to make sure that people take care of themselves, maintain social distance, maintain hygiene, wear masks, although at the beginning people say it's not helpful at all, and then suddenly it became helpful. As time went by, people expressed more anxiety, I believe, due to those conferences, the daily conferences. You felt that things are changing constantly, that the decision makers often are not sure about how to handle this issue. They were learning the issue themselves. And the issue of mental health was not addressed at all. It was not an issue at all. People were worried about physical health and breaking the chains of contagion. And so the issue of mental health was not addressed at all. You know, and some we had some leaders saying also, you know, that just go out and have fun, don't worry about it. This issue was not considered at all until it was a huge pressure from public services, psychological public services, that started stressing that the issue of mental health and mental wellness will be addressed as well. This issue was not handled at all.
On social media, here's what users said. Norian said, little is known about the Israeli Jews suffering in Israel under their right-wing regime. Children being taken from parents. An estimated 200 fathers a year have killed themselves. I heard this in a podcast from an Israeli activist. There is much poverty. All people deserve humanity. Yossi Berstein says she bets more women will suffer from domestic violence than the virus. Priya says, world's first psychiatric corona ward has opened in Israel. I had predicted this would happen. Corona will eventually go away, but people need to keep their minds sane. It's a mental challenge for the world.
לעתיד שלהם שעכשיו אנחנו מרגישים שאנשים מרגישים לחץ נפשי כל הזמן, הם נמצאים במצב מדוכא ובונים לטיפול בתדירות מאוד גבוהה מאשר שאנחנו הכרנו לפני. אני רואה בזה חומרה רבה מאוד, ואנשים מחפשים יציבות מבחינה חברתית ופוליטית.
כי אחד מהסיבות שהחיים של כולם השתנה ממה שהיה לנו לפני הקורונה, שינוי של מעל 160 מעלות, כן? מעל 360 מעלות ממה שהיה לנו, כן? בוא נגיד, אנחנו פנסיונרים היינו מגיעים למועדון לעשות שחייה, עכשיו אין לנו את האופציה הזאת. היה לנו את האופציה של קולנוע, גם אין לנו את זה. פגישה עם חברים, גם אין לנו. כי אנחנו כולם מפחדים, כן? ואז צריך לשמור.
אנחנו רואים כל שנה, מרגישים שיש עלייה באחוז הפניות של האנשים שסובלים מדיכאון ומחרדה חברתית. וההשפעה הישירה של המצב הפוליטי במדינה ובנוסף למצב הפיננסי הכלכלי גרם לתופעה כזאת ולחרדות אצל אנשים כי אין להם תכנון לעתיד הרחוק ופשוט אין הרגשה בביטחון במצב הזה.
לבן, וזה עצוב לי נורא, ואני בן אדם איש של עבודה, והדבר היחיד שסוגר לי את הבעיה הנפשית שלי זה התעסוקה. ושאין לי תעסוקה זה מגביר לי יותר פי מיליון את הבעיה הנפשית שלי. פי מיליון, אין לך מושג, אני מסיים לילה על ספסלים, יש לי בית, יש לי הכל, אבל אני מסיים לילה על ספסלים. מרוב החוסר אונים שזה עושה לי. אני בן אדם של עבודה, אני קם בבוקר, הולך לעבודה, חוזר לעבודה, וזה הדבר היחיד שמוציא אותי מהמצב עצמו. אבל אני איפשהו מצאתי עבודה קטנה פה, מחר אני אנסה עוד עבודה, אבל אני נותן צ'אנסים לעצמי. אבל לפעמים איפשהו אני נשבר.
חברות וחברי הכנסת, אנחנו עוברים להצבעה על אישור ההסכם.
There is great political instability in Israel right now, and the coronavirus is being used as a political tool, for instance, to shut down demonstrations in front of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's home. The politicization of this COVID crisis is causing great anxiety among Israeli people, and Israeli people have good cause to question the actions of their government, even the legitimacy of their government.
The issue of mental disorders is prevalent in the Israeli military as well. In fact, 1/3 of the Israeli males and 44% of females avoid being drafted into the military for mental health reasons. To avoid the mandatory service, Israelis rely on a military law that allows recruits to receive an exemption on grounds of medical or health issues. According to Israeli law, any individual whose health standards is less than 21 points is exempted from the military service. Some pretend to be suffering from poor mental health or disability to score low grades, an act seen as extremely dangerous by Israeli authorities. The mental health crisis in Israel is impacting all sectors and parts of Israeli society. An Israeli crisis hotline says it is receiving an unprecedented level of suicidal calls, and many of them are from people who did not have any previous diagnosed mental health issues before the pandemic started. According to the non-profit organization that is supported by the health ministry, Iran, since the onset of the coronavirus crisis, some 5,500 Israelis who are considering ending their lives have made contact. According to Iran, it took 240,000 emergency calls since the pandemic started. About 60% of these calls are about dealing with daily challenges, financial and employment problems, mental health, and identity crises. The organization stated that 86% of inquiries come from people in crisis, or what it called emotional overload. So far, according to the organization, there is no end top these numbers in sight.
Well, in recent years, we've seen reports that there is an increase in Israeli youngsters trying to avoid drafting by reporting all kinds of mental health and other issues About half of them, about 44% of them, were ultra-Orthodox, what we call Haredim, and pretty much the same number, about 46% were secular. In some groups in Israeli society, it became unfashionable to go to the military. I don't think it's a necessarily a result of mental health problems among young people, partly, which I'll discuss in a minute, but also that it became not such a problem, not such a stigma in Israel, not serving in the army, because it just doesn't fit me anymore, and I'm not too crazy about military service. It's going to take 2 or 3 years of my life. I believe that having policies that change constantly, that are clearly affected by political issues, and decisions are not based on professional expert opinions, are very difficult to digest and to be accepted. When you see that the entire country is in lockdown, while actually only certain cities are red cities, because of a high percentage of sick people, but the entire country goes into lockdown because certain groups oppose closing down just those cities, you understand that there's little professional advice involved in this issue. And therefore, the trust in one's government, in policymakers, in decision makers, in high-ranking officials, has deteriorated dramatically. And therefore, you don't know whom to believe. When different ministries are fighting with each other, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Treasure,
On social media, here's what users said. Medusa is done says she's sick of war and the endless glorification of war and military violence. In Israel, so many kids are gung-ho about going into combat units and end up with PTSD and massive mental health issues for the rest of their lives. But no one talks about that. Marwa says, how about Israel pays reparations for the mental health of Lebanese who endured its terrorism and still do down south? Jonathan says, if Israel cared about the mental health of its soldiers, it would stop making them be an occupying force that denies the humanity of other people.
להגיד שהם מנסים את מיטב יכולתם כאילו לעזור לאנשים ולהציל אותם מהבועה הזאת, אבל את המשאבים שיש להם זה לא מספיק בינתיים. אנחנו כל הזמן דורשים להתערבות ישירה ולפתוח מוקדים לקליטת אנשים או לטפל באנשים שסובלים מחרדות או מדיכאון, כך להציל אותם בינתיים אשר המצב שלא יחמיר בעקבות זה.
אני הייתי מעדיף משהו. אם אנחנו במקרה של כרמל, עיר שיש לו את התו הירוק, לא היינו צריכים להשתתף בסגר האחרון. באוכלוסייה שלנו היינו יכולים עם השמירה של המרחק ועם המסכה להמשיך להגיע לבריכה, ואנחנו שילמנו אותו מחיר כמו תושבים אחרים של המדינה. זה מה שקשה לנו, כן, להבין את זה, אבל עושים אותו, כן?
הרבה אנשים מכונסים בתוך עצמם, הרבה אנשים, והם לא יודעים מה יהיה לטובתם, מה לא יהיה לטובתם, מה יועיל להם, אם לעזור לאנשים או לא לעזור לאנשים, אם לתת יד או לא לתת יד, ככה זה עובד.
המצב הכלכלי הפיננסי במדינה השפיע באופן ישיר על האנשים. אנחנו רואים אנשים שהם בקריסה משמעותית, וזה השפיע על תפקודם במשפחה וגם תפקודם החברתי. אנחנו מרגישים שיש אנשים שהם בסטרס מאוד גבוה, גם יש להם חרדה מאשר מהעתיד, מה מחכה להם. אנחנו רואים שיש אנשים גם שניסו לפגוע בעצמם לאחרונה, והאחוז זה עולה, וזה מדאיג אותנו בינתיים.
אבל אני מבקש לומר לכם שניצני הנורמליזציה כבר שם, בהמתנה ללבלוב. אם נמשיך במדיניות שהתוויתי, אני משוכנע שהפריחה תיראה גם מעל פני השטח, ויהיו עוד מדינות שיצטרפו רשמית למעגל השלום.
Some people don't agree with the service in the army, but it's a tiny minority. There is a minority of people who do not want to serve in the army for religious reasons. But there is a small, tiny minority of people who feel that they cannot serve in the Israeli army for various reasons. Some of them might be political, but it's a tiny minority. You have to understand that the people usually serve in the Israeli army willingly and not so much under duress. However, there is a small minority, a very small number, less than 1% or even less than that, who might opt for a release from the army under some kind of mental health suggestion. But this is a tiny group of people.
Researchers warn that the problem of mental health will persist with or without coronavirus because of the lack of innovative interventions. People, according to experts, need to receive appropriate mental health services, but it is almost impossible due to the limitations related to the economic, social, and technological barriers. The health ministry and the regime are not reaching out by the technology available to Israelis for their mental health care. Given Israel's multi-ethnic society, information is not communicated in a linguistically and culturally appropriate manner, researchers found. This means that the regime and bureaucracy are not using the language used by many Israelis to communicate with them. It only uses the official Hebrew language. Also, religious leaders and organizations play a prominent role in Israeli society and serve as trusted sources of mental health information and referrals. Technically, there are no too limited efforts being made to facilitate the religious and mental health care sectors working more closely together. This leaves the average Israeli citizen with mental health problems wondering how they can seek help in a helpless society. Here's the news making the press in Israel. Ynet News. The health ministry reported that 4,036 Israelis passed away during September, a rise of 18.6% compared to the same period in 2019, even though Israel's population only grew by 2%. The ministry also said that 642 people succumbed to coronavirus in September, accounting for 1 in 6 of all fatalities that month. The Times of Israel, an Israeli study that researched people's financial responses to the direct one-time coronavirus stimulus payments distributed by the regime in August, found that more people used their fiscal stimulus checks to pay outstanding debts rather than going out and spending. The study found that among respondents to the survey, the main use of the grants, 42%, was paying down outstanding debt. Just a little over a fourth, 26%, reported they increased their spending after receiving the grant, and 15% said they saved the money. I-24 News. Israel insists what had caused a power outage in many areas across Israel was not caused by a cyber attack. In a statement released by Israel Electric Corporation, it was stressed that the private power station in Be'er Tuvia stopped working, which led to a chain reaction in other surrounding stations. The Jerusalem Post. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his life is threatened on a daily basis, but the threats are not being taken seriously. When opposition members took offense at Netanyahu for equating threats against him with Rabin's assassination by a right-wing extremist, he said he could give examples. He also accused the press then and now of being monolithic and presenting only one side, and warned against silencing political rivals.